4 months ago, I realized that the Revolution Wind project was probably going to be approved, and that was pretty shocking to me. People who live in Newport know that they've been talking about offshore wind in Newport, around Newport for 20 years. But it always seemed like that would never happen. So as I started to look into this, I figured there must be a lot of groups opposing this, and I started Googling around trying to find out who was working to mitigate or to stop this. And I was really surprised to find that there really wasn't anyone. And the only group I could find was Green Oceans over in Little Compton. So Green Oceans, I contacted them. They're focused on informing the public about the threats of offshore wind and specifically the threats to the environment and the marine ecosystem. So this group is focused on the ecology and the marine environment and specifically biodiversity. So, I hooked up with these people, and the two founders are on the call today, Lisa Kotaki Knight and Bill Thompson. And at the end of the call, we'll get into Q&A, and they'll be able to answer any additional questions that you have. But what I've been doing is really trying to do a super deep dive. I spent the last 4 months almost exclusively focused on this technology, the project, figuring out what's going on, where it's happening, what's the schedule, and sort of all of the details. So I put this presentation together. I've been writing emails and posting on social media, really just to create awareness. And there's been an awful lot of interest in this topic. So today I'm going to talk about what's being built and where, what the impact's going to be, some of the details of the offshore wind and the technology, and some of the legal remedies that are available to oppose or to stop these developments. I'm going to talk also about the funding needs and the urgency given the timing. So what are we fighting against? We're fighting against the industrialization of the last unspoiled area on Earth, which is our oceans. There's almost no place you can go today where you don't see man's imprint, be it a road or a power line or something. But out at sea in the off our coastal waters, that was really the last unspoiled area. So we're fighting against the government subsidized damage to our marine habitats, the despoiling of our unique marine vistas and our open ocean views. And in general, this is just the degradation of Rhode Island's coastline, and that's the national treasure that should be protected. So this is really a focused effort to stop Revolution Wind, which is sited on an environmentally sensitive area called Cox's Ledge, and it's also the project that's closest to Rhode Island. So in the aggregate, the offshore wind plans that are off Rhode Island are for the construction of up to 1,000 turbines. Now these wind generators are 870 feet tall, and they're only located 12.9 nautical miles off the coast of Rhode Island. And as you may know, this has been politically driven by urgent mandates from Washington to get this built prior to 2024. So there's been a tremendous political push, not a push from the grid operators. So this map is showing you how many turbines are planned to be built. So each one of those dots is a turbine. Each of those different colors is a different wind farm project. So collectively, this is close to 1 million acres of turbines. These are the largest turbines ever built anywhere. It's the greatest number in one location anywhere on Earth. And again, collectively, this is one of the largest offshore marine construction projects in the history of the world. The cumulative area of this is larger than the entire state of Rhode Island, and yet only 4% of that power that's being generated from all of these wind farms is slated for Rhode Island. So the developers here were very clever in the sense that each one of these different colored tracks is a separate LLC, many of them owned by the same companies, each with a different name, each with a different power purchase agreement, each separately licensed and separately approved. So, and all the environmental studies were done on each one of these separately, not cumulatively. So why is Cox's Ledge matter? And it's really a question of biodiversity. Cox's Ledge is a glacial terminal moraine. That's a glacial formation that supports a diverse marine habitat and species. It's teeming with life. It hosts the endangered North Atlantic right whale, and it's one of the most productive fisheries in all of New England. Cox's Ledge is literally the only remaining spawning ground for the southern New England cod. And Revolution Wind is located on Cox's Ledge. So it's the closest project to Rhode Island. This project was approved. It got their final approval about a month ago, and construction is about to start. In fact, construction has started on some of the shoreside facilities. So each one of those dots is a wind turbine, and each one is interconnected with an undersea cable to an offshore power station. So those yellow squares that you see, each one of those is a power plant. So there are two of these power substations for Revolution Wind. There's one for South Fork, and there's one for Sunrise behind that. Each one of these has to have their own power substation. All of those are interconnected via underground cables. These cables, there will be hundreds of miles of these cables, not only interconnecting the actual turbines, but if you see those going back for a second, those green, dark green lines going up the West Passage to Quonset, and the one that just got approved in Portsmouth, which is for South Coast Wind, which is pretty far offshore. So those are going right up Narragansett Bay and right up the Sakonnet River. So hundreds of miles of cables, and the way they install them is with jet plows. These are very powerful digging tools that blast about roughly 100-meter area wide, 6 feet deep, and these cables get buried, which doesn't sound that bad, but these sediment plumes cover the spawning grounds. And in Rhode Island, we've had hundreds of years of heavy industry, including the jewelry industry, so there are lead, all kinds of chemicals, and from the industry and from the Navy, these forever chemicals, the PFAs, all this is potentially going to be dredged up and potentially contaminating the waters and our sea life. So I mentioned each one of those cables then gets routed to one of these high voltage substations. These are power plants, right? They're almost identical in appearance to an offshore oil rig. They're quite large. They're 220 feet tall. They're the size of a football field. And the ironic thing here is that the power from the windmills goes to shore through these substations, but the power goes so that the power substation is also powered by the grid. And each one of these substations has 50,000 gallons of diesel fuel, so there's 100,000 gallons of diesel fuel here. And why is that? That's for the backup generators, because you can't run a wind farm on wind power because it's too intermittent. So they literally have the 1.2 megawatt generators here to power the wind farm when the wind isn't blowing. So it's a little ironic. So the size and scale of these turbines is really unprecedented. And I've been posting and telling people how big these are, and telling people you just don't understand how big they are. And then last Saturday I went to New Bedford and actually saw one in person, and I was the one who didn't understand how big they are. They're much larger than the ones in these photos. It's just very difficult to wrap your head around. You see on the right hand side there's a guy standing inside one of the blades. So the blades are about 22 feet wide in addition to being 300 feet long. So these monopile foundations that the turbines sit on are gigantic. They weigh 2,000 tons. This is 2,000 tons of steel, and these get hammered into the seabed by pile drivers. So it's pile driven in about 150 feet into the seabed. These monopiles are 40 feet in diameter, and they're 5 inches thick, solid steel. So just to give you a sense of perspective, here's one of the turbines superimposed against the Newport Bridge. So you can see the pillars of the bridge are about 400 feet tall. These are 870 feet tall. In fact, at this height is taller than every building in Boston, so taller than the John Hancock Tower. In fact, there's only 28 buildings in all of New York City that are as tall as these wind turbines. And there's going to be 1,000 of these off our coast, which will really turn this into an industrial zone. So, and it's not just about Newport. I mean, these will be visible from every shoreline in Rhode Island. Little Compton, there will be hundreds of turbines visible according to the government. And here you see the Sakonnet Lighthouse next to one of the Siemens wind turbines. It doesn't even make it beyond the bottom of the monopile. Truly industrial scale. And that's why, a lot of people say, don't worry, these things are going to be so far offshore, you're never going to see them. Well, you are going to see them, and the reason is because they're so tall, even with the curvature of the Earth, they're going to be completely visible. So you can see at 15 miles, almost the entire turbine is still visible, so only the bottom 75 feet or so will be obscured. And that's why the turbines that are being built now at South Fork, which is the one immediately further away than Revolution, that one is very visible on clear days, as they're already constructing that one. So to give you a sense of what the view will be, here is the simulation that's on the BOEM, which is the Bureau of Energy, Offshore Energy Management, the Department of the Interior. This is on their website, showing you what this is going to look like. This is Revolution Wind as viewed from the breakers at Cliff Walk. So the turbines themselves, the closest one I mentioned is 12.9. There you see the location in relation to sort of Newport and Little Compton. And in terms of the number of turbines that are visible, again, this is on their website, on the government website. It's between 500 and 600 turbines will be visible from Newport and Middletown. So the impact of that on tourism is going to be significant. They've studied this. There's a University of North Carolina study, their Center for Environmental Resource Policy, and it shows that there's a substantial portion of the survey population would simply change their vacation destination if wind farms were placed within visual range of the beach. The original study was to talk about how much this would impact rental income for on the shore based rental units, and they were surprised to see that people would simply rather just go somewhere else. And when asked about that, officials said, well, once every beach on the East Coast looks like this, then they won't have anywhere else to go, so you won't lose your rental income. That wasn't a very encouraging comment. So the good news is, as facts start to come out, support plummets. So the more people find out, and that's really what I've been doing. I've been, as I mentioned, been posting on social media, talking to people and emailing, and I've just been shocked at how little people were informed about this ahead of time. Now that it's approved, people are saying, wait a minute, I didn't know about this. We didn't vote for this. So as more people start to find out what's actually about to happen in Rhode Island, support is plummeting. Because in principle, it sounds nice. Windmills, I saw one at Block Island. It's, that's not so bad, But this is something that's completely different in terms of size and scale. In New Jersey, support went from 80% to down to 50%, and that's not 50% of the people who live on the beach. This is for the entire state of New Jersey, and eventually they were able to get that project canceled there. So the environmentalists are incredibly concerned about the what's happening to the large marine mammals. In the last 12 months, 78 large whales have died on the East Coast, and this is near where the offshore wind survey and construction sites are. And NOAA declared this an unusual mortality event. So now, in typical government fashion, they're going to study this, and the study will be finished sometime after all the wind farms are built. And if you raise this objection, people point out and say, no, that's not true, because whales die primarily by either entanglement or ship strikes, and that's true. But the question here is, why the sudden increase? And one theory is that the seismic surveys and pile driving are making them deaf, which is why they collide with ships and why they get disoriented, or why they end up on the beach. And again, this isn't, there's some, save the whale, person just making up stories here. This is a letter written a year ago from the chief of protected species for NOAA, talking about the impact, population level impacts on the North Atlantic right whale, and there's only 350 of these left. So this is not some crazy person, saying that this is going to be a problem. This is literally the head of the protected species at NOAA. So what's much less controversial is the impact of wind farms on birds. So you have developers paying giant fines for killing 135 uh, bald and golden eagles. And just last week, French court literally ordered the dismantling of a wind farm because it was killing so many birds. And the reason for that is it's sited in the wrong place. And that's something that we need to keep coming back to, is that location matters. So here in Rhode Island, we've got migratory birds, birds that are on the endangered species list, like the piping plover, are literally flying through this wind farm field. Which again, I can't help but point out the irony here is that those of us who've lived in New England know that periodically beaches get closed because, hey, you can't walk on the beach because there's piping plovers nearby. But if you want to build a wind farm with 1,000 turbines that are 875 feet tall, that's just fine, right in their migratory path. And again, it comes back to this concept of environmental footprint. Like, why do you need 1 million acres? You don't need 1 million acres to produce electricity. Offshore wind is 350 times, it uses 350 times more land or sea area than other resources. It's just way too intensive compared to gas or nuclear even. It also is very resource intensive. Offshore wind uses 15 times the minerals and 10 times the construction materials, 20 times the steel and cement. Cement alone accounts for about an enormous percentage of the CO2 production in the world. In fact, if it was a country, it'd be in the top 10 countries producing CO2. And all of this, doesn't get built, by, elves in the Black Forest in Denmark. All of this material primarily comes from China, because, for example, China produces more steel than the rest of the world combined. China and India are the two largest steel producers. China and India produce almost all of the cement. The vast majority, 80% of the rare earth minerals come from China, including the neodymium, which is used in the permanent magnets of the offshore wind generators. Each one of these, once the steel is manufactured in a monopile, is 2,000 tons. Steel monopile is shipped 4,000 miles to Rhode Island. Now, to put that in perspective, 2,000 tons, there's 1,000 of these things. That's the same amount of steel as 2 million cars. So if someone said, hey, we're going to dump 2 million cars worth of steel into the ocean, starting with Cox's Ledge, you'd say that they were crazy. And maybe you'd be right. It's also, in terms of environmental impact, cobalt is used with the neodymium in the magnets. It's also a coating for the magnets to prevent corrosion offshore. And cobalt is one of the nastiest materials. It's mined by hand in the Congo under deplorable conditions. And another impact is the balsa wood for the blades. There's been a shortage of balsa wood because so many blades are being built that they're now being harvested illegally from South American rainforest. Again, so. And lastly, on the environmental impact, the wind blades themselves cannot be recycled. In Texas, they're finding that the blades get replaced after about 10 years, and all of those blades end up in landfills. Now, Siemens says that these blades are going to last 20 years. Okay, fine. Then 20 years from now, these 3,000 blades that are the size of what I showed you in the first couple slides, all of those are going to end up in landfills. And that's 200 linear miles worth of those giant blades. Now, I'm not saying that offshore wind or these turbines are uniquely bad products. What I'm trying to point out is that these are industrial scale systems, power plants that generate electricity. So it's not some magic solution that somehow is green and wonderful, and runs on pixie dust. These are real industrial heavy industries, and they have the same type of environmental impact or more because they're so resource intensive than any other industrial scale construction project. But as a sailor, one of the things that I find annoying is that wind farms also reduce wind speed. And at first, people say, wait, how can that be? And then if you think about it for half a second, you go, oh yeah, of course. The wind turbines are extracting kinetic energy from the flow. And there's no way to manufacture energy. They can use it up, and they use it up. And downwind, as every sailor knows, you don't want to be downwind of a competitor in a sailboat race because they've used the wind that you want to use. So this is a problem. Also, so that's in the air, and in the water, the same type of thing happens, but with the ocean currents creating sediment plumes. Those sediment plumes, again, cover the fish spawning areas, and they can also deoxygenate the water. It was just a report that came out 2 weeks ago in the North Sea where they're finding dead zones now in these wind farms where the sea surface, the subsurface has been deoxygenated. And the last, getting back to the irony of this presentation, is that wind farms raise surface temperatures. So, and the way that happens is that they mix the hot air rises, especially at night, and these are 1,000 feet tall, so they're mixing the warm air from above down. And the study came out, they looked at 28 wind farms, 100%, all 28 raise the surface temperature. So if your concern is, sometimes people say, well, the whales, they're going to die because of climate change, it's going to get warmer. So in this case, you're literally increasing the surface temperature by 1 degree instantaneously the day the wind farm gets turned on. And, the equivalent, that would take 100 years at the current rate, if you say, well, we're saving CO2 and it's going to get warmer anyway. The study said, yes, that's true, but it would take 100 years. So let's talk about energy output. Revolution Wind, it's 700 megawatts, and that's if the wind is blowing at the right speed, which is about 35 miles an hour, and then it produces a maximum of 700. Of that, 400 is going to go to Rhode Island, and 304 to Connecticut. But the wind doesn't always blow exactly at the right speed, so on average, you get about 40% of that number. Block Island, I just checked this weekend, and it's running at about 37% this year. So 40% is a reasonable estimate. So Rhode Island's going to get 160 megawatts, which sounds like a lot, but when you realize that Rhode Island has 6 gas-fired power plants, and they have a capacity of 2,200 megawatts. So all of this is going to add less than 10% of the power generation capacity that we already have in Rhode Island. And oh, by the way, we're only using about half of that today. So we're only using about 1,100 megawatts. So we don't need this power. So it may be intermittent, but at least it's expensive. So the offshore energy is 2 to 3x the cost of the least costly alternatives, according to the U.S. government. These contracts are worth billions of dollars. The Revolution Wind contract alone is close to $5 billion because the energy companies have signed what's called a power purchase agreement, and they are committed. They must buy 100% of the electricity from the wind farm, whether it's needed or not, for the next 20 years. And that price is $98 per megawatt hour. And we're currently paying about $40 for natural gas generated electricity cost. In addition to that, the developer is getting 70%, up to 70% tax credits to build it. And in other projects in New York, some of which are located off Rhode Island, the Powers for New York, they've asked for a 71% increase. They're asking for $167 per megawatt hour. More economic bad news for Rhode Island is the fishing industry. So seafood is a $500 million industry in Rhode Island, has 3,000 jobs. Both NOAA and the CRMC's Fishermen's Advisory Board have issued warnings that went unheeded. And I shouldn't say unheeded, because in the final environmental impact statement, the government says the overall cumulative impact to commercial fisheries and recreational fishing would be major adverse. And that's as bad, that's the worst category they have. So this is as bad as it can get, according to them. Which is probably why the entire Fishermen's Advisory Board resigned en masse a couple of months ago. And they said it's just abundantly clear that the Rhode Island CRMC is made deference to the wind developers their priority, regardless of the requirements of the ocean SAMP, which is a special area of management, which is what they're supposed to be focused on. And again, this isn't a bunch of fishermen. Oh, what do the fishermen know about fish? No, this also came from, again, NOAA, the fisheries service at NOAA, that this project poses a high risk of population level impacts to the southern New England cod. So population level impact could include extinction. So it'll result in significant alterations of the Cox's Ledge ecosystem. So this is now well documented. So how does this work mechanically? I mentioned that these giant things get pounded into the seabed, but even then they still have to protect them. So they pour something called scour protection, which is almost 8,000 cubic yards of stone that gets dumped around the monopile and then covered with cement. So that creates a dead zone in the middle of the area. Sorry. And those cables that I talked about, those cables carry 2,500 amps at 275,000 volts. So this is an enormous amount of current flowing, which generates a significant EMF. And they've tested that, and that causes deformities in invertebrates, things like lobsters. Also, that amount of current generates a heat, which raises the water temperature nearby by as much as 36 degrees locally. And remember, these are crisscrossing all across, Cox's Ledge. It's not just one cable. There's hundreds of miles of those cables. So the bottom line is that all this stuff needs to be done responsibly. So if you're an advocate for green energy, you should also be an advocate for citing this stuff in a logical place. So for example, if you're a supporter of solar energy, solar power, you should still be against clear-cutting the Amazon rainforest and plastering it with solar panels. And in effect, that's what we have here. I mean, Cox's Ledge is sort of our rainforest. And it comes down to trusting these people to do what's environmentally responsible. And somehow people think that suddenly these companies are paragons of environmental stewardship. But these big wind companies, are the big oil companies, right? So all the companies who are developing wind energy off Rhode Island, they are the fossil fuel companies. Yet it's funny, it always gets turned around. They say, if you're against this wind farm project, you must be a shill for the fossil fuel companies. And they say Green Ocean must be taking big donations from the fossil fuel companies, which the fossil fuel companies find hilarious because they're the ones who are pushing this, of course. For example, the Danish oil and natural gas company, which used to be called Dong, which wasn't a great name to begin with, rebrands itself as Ørsted, and they're the ones behind the project in Rhode Island. Well, Ørsted gets the majority of their money from burning coal. I mean, this is Bloomberg last year. They get a nice big profit boost from their coal burning power plants. And what's interesting, in Denmark, they have enough wind power to cover 200% of their energy requirements. And yet, they still get 25% of their power from burning trees. The other 25% comes from coal. So even in Denmark, the wind doesn't blow enough to rely on wind energy. And not coincidentally, Denmark, Germany, Ireland, the UK are the 4 countries with the greatest amount of offshore wind, and those are the 4 countries in descending order of the most expensive electricity on Earth. So in this environmental impact statement, the government said, okay, there's going to be a major impact on tourism, there's going to be a major negative impact on jobs, there's a major impact on commercial fishing, and an adverse impact on the North Atlantic right whale. So they've documented all of these. So it's a little bit like a legal case where you just want summary judgment because the facts aren't in dispute. Everything in this presentation you can find on the BOEM website. Just read the environmental impact statement. They've documented it all. So the facts aren't in dispute, but they want to do it anyway. Property values, they didn't analyze that, but other studies have shown, like in Europe, that there's about a 15% reduction in property values. So the takeaway from this is not good for Rhode Island. But the argument is, well, at least we're going to save the world, right? But again, they say no. They say this is not going to have any impact on climate change. There will be no impact on global warming in their environmental impact statement. You say, well, how can that be? This is going to reduce CO2, right? Well, no, because in the short term, you're front loading years of CO2. All that steel and cement that I talked about that's made in China, with coal power. So you're going to generate an enormous amount of CO2. And if you think we're at a tipping point, that's not a great thing to do right now. So construction generates a huge amount of CO2 from the millions of tons of steel and fiberglass cement, the diesel fuel that's used for heavy mining of those minerals, transportation, install, all that stuff. But in the long term, it gets worse because what happens is, why is all the steel in the world being made in China? The reason is they have very low cost energy, and energy intensive things will gravitate towards places where there are low energy costs. China's building one new coal plant per week. So this is going to accelerate that. So more and more of the heavy industry, the raw materials are going to be built in India and China, which will actually increase the amount of CO2 produced. So the net result of all of this is that while we're producing energy from wind, which is expensive and intermittent, we're also putting our gas-powered power plants into standby mode. And a gas power plant in standby mode still consumes about 25% of the energy that it would if it was running at full speed. So right off the bat, 25% of the energy is still being burned, except you're not making any electricity. And when you start and stop a gas power plant, because the wind is intermittent and it's intermittent at all time scales, that causes the power plant to go from 60% efficiency to 35%, which means it burns 70% more gas to make the same amount of electricity. So you add all that up, it's unlikely that you're actually reducing any CO2, even locally. But given that you are, the fact is, globally, more CO2 will be produced because of these projects. Meanwhile, in Europe, they've started to figure this out. They're dismantling some of their wind farms in Germany, expanding their coal production, which is not a good thing. But the wind just can't power. They're already talking about the deindustrialization of Europe because the energy costs are so high. They're losing some important businesses. But not us. I mean, in Rhode Island, not guilty. We have no coal plants in the state. We're one of the few in the country that doesn't get any of its power for coal. We have except for Vermont, we have the lowest CO2 emissions already. We've spent the money to move to natural gas. So, why do we have to do this? Before you start thinking that you're crazy for opposing this, you need to realize that that the tide has turned. You look at the press, the New York Times, the Telegraph in Europe, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, CNBC. People are figuring out that this is not a good idea. CO2 emissions are going up per unit of energy produced, which is crazy. In Scandinavia, they're building 10 new nuclear power plants, and they're finding that the grid is a big issue. So when they talk about the cost of these things, they don't tell you what the cost of improving the power grid is to route all this power from Rhode Island to New York. So all that's off balance sheet. But the good news is that people are really starting to figure this out. Not only is it bad for consumers, but it's a bad investment. These companies are taking billions and billions of dollars in write-offs because it just doesn't make economic sense. And it doesn't make economic sense for us, and it only exists because of government subsidies. So as I mentioned, they get up to 70% tax incentives, and the cost is 2 to 3 times. And you have to realize there's no battery storage with these projects, which makes it really crazy. So if it's producing electricity and it's not needed, it gets wasted. If it's needed but the wind isn't blowing, there isn't any electricity. And on average, wind produces 0 electricity 7 hours a day. So when they tell you, oh, we're going to have 100,000 homes powered by wind, no, you're not. You're not going to have a single home powered by wind because there's no homeowner anywhere in the world who wants to have no electricity for 7 hours a day. So in summary, this is the single worst location in Rhode Island Sound, according to Save the Bay. It's intermittent, expensive energy that isn't green, clean, or sustainable. It risks irreparable damage to the ocean and its inhabitants. It's going to hurt the local economy. It's going to hurt local homeowners and ratepayers. And political pressure and subsidies have really rushed these projects through the approval process. And that opens up many avenues for legal challenge, because all of these environmental laws, they don't have a special carve out where it says except for windmills. So unfortunately though, despite the failures in New Jersey where they were able to get the project stopped, Ørsted and Revolution Wind is pushing very hard to get these built quickly in Rhode Island. They are not backing down at all. So what can we do? Complaining is fun, but it's not very productive. So this is really last call. I assume that the government or city council or environmental groups or somebody would step in and stop this, but that didn't happen. So at this point, we've filed some litigation to stop these things, and we really need you all to join the effort to help fund this, because right now this is the only way. If we don't do this, they are going to be built, and some of them are already being built. The Vineyard Wind that we want to do, and I just think they're going to wonder who the hell let this happen, and I don't think we should let this happen. So, thank you for your